Thank you. Thanks everyone for coming. Thanks to Professor Robert Putnam for coming as well. I'm not going to spend long introducing Robert Putnam. I suspect most of you are here because you know exactly who he is. It's almost 25 years, isn't it, since you published the research which then became the book, right, Bowling Alone, which has been so defining. And I've always thought of, formerly, Robert Putnam, Professor of Public Policy at the Kennedy School and Harvard University. I've always thought of Bob as one of those academics who does more than just hold up a mirror to society, but actually has become a kind of conscience of an idea of America and an idea of the American dream. What is America doing to its communities? What is it doing to its politics? What is it doing to its kids? And by extension, of course, what are we doing on all those fronts to our communities, our politics, our kids? Because although there are big differences, there are some similarities too. And I think it's no coincidence that Professor Putnam has been avidly followed by politicians of both left and right in this country, as well as in America. Those of you who've been to a ThinkIn before will know how these things run. But I only say that in order to say we're not going to run it like that today. So what we're getting from Robert Putnam is effectively a preview of a book that you're going to publish next year. Yes. And so we need to give Bob time to set out the thesis. So we'll have, what we don't normally have is a presentation. So we'll have a presentation followed by questions at the end. If we drift a little past 2 o'clock in the questioning, then if anybody has to go, it's a working day, then I think we'll understand that, but we may take advantage if there's a few questions hanging over. So with that, Bob, can I hand over to you, and thank you for coming.
Thank you all for coming. Well, what a treat. I've known this guy actually for a long time. I'm proud to say that he was a student in one of my classes.
I was.
A few years ago.
2004, yeah.
And I'm going to be talking only about America today because that's what I know, and the new book is about America. I'm leaving aside for a second discussion whether any of parts of this story that I'm going to tell would apply to this country. But I did want to assure you that actually I do know a little bit about British politics. Indeed, raise your hand if you are under 55. Okay, if you're under 55, I've been working in Westminster and Whitehall since before you were born. So I do know a decent amount.
Can you say 56?
Huh?
Can you try 56? Just
I didn't even know that. Okay. 1963, 64 was when I first started studying British politics. So I want to tell you a story about that is in some sense related to the argument of Bowling Alone. Would you raise your hands if this is really just helping me understand what I should be talking about here? Raise your hands if you have ever heard of the book Bowling Alone. And then raise your hands if you don't really know what it means, because I'm going to use the expression bowling alone. Okay, so I will try to be clear about that. Bowling Alone, I can just say in one sentence, is about how American forms of connection, social connection, including bowling leagues, that's why it's called Bowling Alone, deteriorated over the years, roughly speaking, from 1965 to 1995 when I wrote it. So it was a discussion of declines in social connection, what I call social capital, over those 30, 35 years. This book is, in some respects, related to that, but it's different in two really big, important respects. One is it widens a lot the time horizon. So rather than looking from 1965 to 1995, what Bowling Alone did, this book looks at America from roughly 1890 to today. And it turns out that if you look at that whole century and a bit, you get a different understanding, at least I get a different understanding of what's happened in America. And secondly, the book pretty radically expands the number of topics I look at. So rather than just looking at social connection and community, the new book is going to look at things like income inequality and political polarization and cultural narcissism or cultural individualism, as well as social connections. And that also will change a little bit the understanding of Bowling Alone. So if you've read Bowling Alone, you'll recognize sort of where I'm sort of coming from, but I urge you to listen carefully to what I'm saying now, because my story has changed, actually. As my focus widened, both functionally and in time, I have a different perspective. You'll see what I mean in just a second. So, and actually, my Bowling Alone was kind of a, despite myself, it was kind of a downward trajectory, and you could easily be pessimistic after you read Bowling Alone and think everything's going to hell in a handbasket. This new book, I hope, by having a longer time horizon and a wider array of issues to look at, will actually turn it on its head. And so I'm going to be talking about how in the past America has confronted problems like Bowling Alone and has successfully resolved them. So this book is meant to be not a dirge for the 60s, but rather a call to arms based on, and the target of the new book is what we call millennials in the US. That is to say, if you're under 35, you are the target audience of this book. Okay, having said that, I want to start with where America is today. And I'm going to be talking only about America, and I'm leaving to you to figure out to what extent what I say applies in the UK. Or in England, if you prefer. Let's have the next slide, please. America today is in a pickle. We have very high levels of economic inequality. The gap between rich folks and poor folks in America is now probably higher than it's ever been in American history. That's a long time. It's not as long as British history, but it's a pretty long time. And probably the gap between rich and poor now is larger than it's ever been. The closest call is back in the 1890s in America, which is called the Gilded Age, and that was an era of great fortunes and lots of poverty. The Rockefellers and Carnegies and so on making a lot of money in sort of quasi-monopolies of the Industrial Revolution, and lots of poor immigrants. That was the last time we were even close to the level of inequality we have now. So very unequal. Independently of that, American politics today are very polarized. The gap between the political parties and the absence of cooperation or even tolerance across political party lines is now greater than it's ever been, with one exception. The other time in American history when the gap between the parties when the degree of political polarization was as great as it is now was between 1855 and 1865, which is our Civil War. Except for the Civil War, we're as polarized as we have ever been. And one example of that is that if you talk to Americans in the 1950s and ask there's a standard question that social psychologists ask about social distance, which essentially in those days was, would you let your daughter marry one? That is, how would you feel about a child of yours marrying someone who's different? And the standard question was asked in those days about how would you feel if your child married someone of a different race, and I'm making the numbers up, but it was something like 70% of Americans would be upset if their child married someone of a different race. And they, just for the fun of it, they asked, how would you feel if your son or daughter married a Democrat or Republican, that is, someone of a different political party, and 5% said they would be upset if their child married someone from a different political party. Today, those numbers are exactly reversed. About 60%, 65% of Americans say they'd be upset if their child married a Republican or a Democrat, but only about 5 to 10% of Americans say they'd be worried about if you married someone of a different race. That's a mark of how dramatically the country has become polarized. We're also increasingly socially isolated. This is the story of Bowling Alone, that we're not connected with one another. And as you'll see, Bowling Alone, it's gotten worse since I wrote Bowling Alone. And finally, and this last one may be interesting to you, and I hope it'll be surprising to you, because culture is a very mushy idea. And the idea that you could measure the degree of cultural individualism or cultural communitarianism if you're a numbers person, I'm a numbers person, if you're a numbers person, the idea you could actually measure it and draw a curve of how individualistic we are or not, it would seem a little counterintuitive, but I'm going to try to show you at least one chart that will illustrate how extremely individualistic we've become. Now, pause just for a minute there. For the most part, I personally think, and probably the middle of most politics in Britain as well as the United States, think equality is a good thing, think extreme political polarization is a bad thing, think social isolation is probably not such a great thing. And so those things, all those good things go together: community equality and political comity. But that's a little bit more different, and I'm also a little bit. I can see some big advantages to individualism. So don't assume right away that I'm going to describe the ups and downs in these things, that I think that all good things to go together and that individualism is an unadulterated bad. I don't think that. I'm a little bit tipped toward communitarianism in my views, but I can see lots of advantages of individualism, and I'll come back to that. So, but anyway, I'll show you in a minute the data, but we are in a pickle. And actually, every American, whatever their other views, agrees we're in an awful pickle. That we're so unequal and so polarized and so socially isolated and so individualistic that we'd like not to be here. Of course, we disagree about how we got here and so on, but we'd like not to be here. So my question is, how did we get here? And by that I mean just looking at the trends historically. How did we get here? And so I'm going to start with a couple of charts, and I'm going to go over these quickly, but you'll get the basic point even in a flash. You'll see the basic point, I think. Let's look at the next slide, which shows trends in economic equality. The graphs are staged such that up is equal. So the red line is the graph of equality. I can hardly read it myself, but the red line is the graph of income equality after taxes, and I can look at it here, after taxes and transfer payments, after government has done its taxing and spending. And the blue line is the same trend, but before government has done its taxes and spending. And in any event, you can see it's pretty clear what's happened, right? I mean, for the first sort of 2/3 of the chart, America was becoming steadily more equal. Back here, a point on this graph, you can look at it. Back here, we were quite unequal. This is the Gilded Age, when there was a big gap between the Rockefellers and the peons in the slums. Up there, we were pretty equal, actually. We were probably as equal up there as Britain was up there, actually. That's the post-war labor, under the Labor government and so on. Britain was pretty equal, and so was America. I don't mean perfectly equal, of course not, but there'd been a big swing, and then you can see it very clearly here. Sort of sometime in the middle 70s, all those lines turned down, and we become less and less equal. And by now, we're back here, and the trends are still going down. In other words, we're still becoming less and less equal, more and more unequal. This is a particular measure. This is the fraction of the national income that is held by the top 1%. But in the book, there are a dozen other graphs using different metrics, and they all tell the same story. So I'm a little bit here relying on your trust. I'm not sure if that's fair, but I'm relying on your trust that I'm not making this up. And if you had more time, I would be delighted to show you the other 10 graphs of economic inequality, all of which look basically like that. They all show the rise, and then the turn, and then the sharp decline. I mean, another graph that looks something like, actually looks a lot like this, for example, is the minimum wage. The minimum wage looks exactly like that. It goes up and then turns down at the same time. The membership in trade unions looks exactly like that. It turns down a little earlier. But basically, many measures that represent measures of social and economic equality have this pattern. And there's been a lot of discussion of that chart, but only half of it. There's been a huge debate in this country and in America and around the Western world about the growth of inequality. Raise your hand if you've not heard about a recent debate about the growth of economic inequality in the Western world. And that debate is all about the period from here down to there. And there's debate about what caused that. Is it trade? Is it automation? Is it Thatcher and Reagan, you know, a whole bunch of theories about it. But that discussion is all about that half. And it's a very interesting discussion. And all I'm saying is, yeah, but how about that? Isn't that also interesting? I mean, and it's as big. And how many of you have heard discussions of that half? Because you're Brits, so maybe there isn't a discussion because there wasn't a period like that. But if you're Americans, there's been zero discussion of that half of the graph. And that's going to be more generally true. Every graph I show you, there's going to be a lot of discussion about the second half of the curves, and essentially no discussion about the first half of the curves. And my claim is going to turn out to be the first half of the curve is actually also instructive for when we get to what's to be done. Okay, so that's economics. Let's turn now to political polarization. Again, if we have the next slide. This is, up here is more collaboration, just because that's the way I chose to do the graph. And you can see there was American politics was very highly polarized here. This happens to be the degree of cross-party collaboration in Congress. But again, there are 10 other measures in the book, all about polarization, looking at local polarization and lots of other measures of polarization. They all look essentially like this. And so polarization was quite high, and therefore cross-party collaboration was quite low around 1900. And then it rose. We began to be more collaborative. The New Deal, if you've heard of the New Deal, people sometimes think of that as a period of great partisan debate between the Democrats and the Republicans, but that wasn't true, actually. Roughly speaking, of the members of Congress who were Democrats, supported FDR, about 2/3 of them favored FDR's reforms, the New Deal, and about 40% of Republicans favored it. So it was surprisingly the New Deal, and even the Great Society, which was Johnson's big deal, was much of Johnson's program was more supported by Republicans than by Democrats. I don't exaggerate that. There was still some party disagreement, but, and now, if you look at the votes on big bills like Obamacare or Trump's overturn, that number, the difference between the fraction of Congress voting for it is like 95-5, 95. And so that's what I mean when I say polarization now is extreme. It's greater now. I mean, of course, the world was different back before slavery, but that's what I mean when I say we're about as divided politically now as we were in the years leading up to the Civil War. I'm not trying to say that we're on the verge of civil war, but I'm trying to give you some sense of how extremely unusual is the period of political polarization in this country. Maybe that will have echoes here, or maybe not. It isn't quite across party lines. It's polarization about a different kind of issue, but it's polarization. And there has been a lot of discussion in American political science. The American Political Science Association just had its convention, and there were dozens of panels on that half of this curve, because it's been the most studied topic in American political science for the last 15 or 20 years. How come American politics have become so polarized? There's been zero discussion of this half of the curve, although in principle you'd think that might be as interesting as the other half. There are other things you'll begin to notice about these curves after a while, but I want to move quickly now to the third topic. Remember, the third topic was social connectedness, or social solidarity, or what I call social capital. And let's have the next slide. This slide actually comes from Bowling Alone, and it's a measure of organizational membership, the degree to which Americans belong to organizations. I've updated it. Bowling Alone was published there, and I had the data to there, and you can see that, talk about prediction in the social sciences, the trends continued exactly as I predicted for the next 20 years. And when I say organizational membership, I mean the following. We looked at 40 big national organizations and then asked what market share each of them had. So we looked, for example, at, let's say, Italian women, Jewish women. What fraction of all Jewish women belonged to Hadassah, which is a Jewish women's organization? In every case, we were asking, of the people who could join X, how many did? So of all American kids, what fraction belonged to the Scouts? And of all American, all black Americans, how many belonged to the NAACP? And of all middle-aged guys over the course of the 20th century, what fraction belonged to one of the animal clubs? Animal clubs is a technical term. it refers to the fact that all men's organizations in America are named for animals. The Lions Club and the Moose Club and the Elks Club and the Eagles Club. So we added up the membership rates of those organizations, and then we mushed them all together, and that's what it looks like. You can see for the first 2/3 of the 20th century, every year more and more Americans joined one of these groups, except for that period in the Great Depression, between 1930 and 1935. There was a huge drop in organizational membership. That same kind of drop was noted elsewhere fundamentally because it turns out unemployment causes people to hunker down. So hit by massive unemployment, people dropped out of organizations, but then coming out of the Great Depression in 1935 and then the post-war period, probably the greatest civic boom in American history was the number of people. Every year, more and more people joined the Scouts or the parent-teacher organizations or any one of these other organizations, until suddenly, silently, mysteriously, beginning in the middle 60s, people stopped going to clubs. And you can see there's been a hemorrhage. So now, back there, the vast majority of Americans we know from surveys at the time attended a club meeting, of some kind of club meeting, regularly every month. And now, only about 4% of Americans, or 5% of Americans, attend a club meeting every month. Now, you might say, well, okay, that's just the old-fashioned organizations, but again, I'm trying to simplify the presentation, and you'll just have to trust me for a moment. We looked at lots and lots of other measures, like going on picnics and so on, and that is not a bad reflection of trends in social involvement in America over this period. Another curve that looks, well, let me go to the next curve, which is a different example, but you'll see what I mean. We have the next curve. This is church membership. Now, I know in this country, church membership seems weird. Whenever I tell people in this country that I'm studying church membership, they look as if I was saying I'm studying Druids or something. But what you have to understand is, whether you like religion or not, religion is a big deal in America. About half of all social connections in America are religious in some way or another. Half of all organizational memberships that people have are in religious organizations. Half of all philanthropy is religious philanthropy. Half of all volunteering is religious. So, like it or not, religion is a big deal in America. But you could see we're becoming a lot more like England. And especially in the recent years, where church involvement, either going to church or being a member of a church, is plummeting. And so we're now becoming a lot more like you, and especially that's generational. So if this were an American audience with the average age it has, the average level of church involvement would be very low in America too, just as it is in this country. But it wouldn't have been if I'd been talking to a group like this 20 or 30 years ago. And that's the trend. And it looks, as you can see, a lot like all the other organizations, the men's clubs and the parent organizations and so on. There are lots of other measures of social capital that I could use, and in a way, I wish I could, because I don't want you to get fixated only on the Elks Club and churches. Another kind of social connection that is surely more familiar to you and won't seem, at least cross-nationally, it'll be familiar to you. You may have a different view of the next graph depending on how old you are, but cross-nationally it won't. The most intimate kind of social connection we can imagine is marriage or family formation. And I want to look at trends in family formation in America over the last 120 years. And I want to say at the outset that if we were only talking about the last 10 years, we'd have to worry about a lot of things like gay marriage and cohabitation, and there'd be a lot of qualifications we'd have to look at. But for this century and a half or century and a quarter view, those things are honestly rounding error. I know it sounds to the younger people like I've just dismissed your whole love life, but actually, I'm not. If we had a lot more time, I'd be happy to talk about trends in cohabitation and what that means and so on. But just stick with me for the moment. Family formation means, at least for most of this period, family formation has meant getting married, and earlier family formation as different from later family formation, and having kids. And so I want to show you, and I'm going to show you just the trends in do people get married or not? And let's have that next chart. So this is the fraction of all Americans in any given year who either were then currently married. That's the blue line. This is the fraction of all Americans who are between ages 25 and 54, who were married. And the red line is, were they ever married? So the only difference is people who were once married but are no longer married are up in the difference between the red and blue line. But you can see it's the same basic curve. And so what you should see is that part over there will not surprise you. It will not surprise you that relatively few Americans in age 25 to 54, well, maybe it won't surprise you, are not married. That is, the ratio of married to unmarried people over there is low. You may be surprised to find back there, this is the olden days, it was also low then. So another way to put it is, what that graph shows you is that what were then called spinsters and bachelors were very common then. They became rarer and rarer then, and they became more and more common in recent years. And it looks almost symmetrical, doesn't it? Now that's just a measure of whether people are or ever have been married. Another graph I could show you, I won't take time, is when do people get married? And the age of first marriage looks exactly like this curve. So back then, if you were going to get married, most people got married in their late 20s or early 30s. Then, in the 1960s, most people who were going to get married got married in their early 20s. And then by now, in this part you do know, most people now who are going to get married put it off until if they're college educated at least, they put it off until they're in their 30s. So it shows you how old I am. I was actually married, and I'm married to the same person, oddly enough, was married in 1963 there, and we got married when I was 21, and when my wife was 22. I like older women, and we got married as basically a week after I graduated from college. We got married. It was natural, and then within a couple of years we had kids, and that was not odd. Actually, on the same day we were married, two or three other couples that we knew got married too. Why was that? Because everybody was getting married. You went to college, and then when you got done college, you went out and got married. I mean, and I'm not saying we were sex fiends or something, but we were. But our own kids, got married when they were 10 years older than we were, and they actually do think we must have been sex fiends. That we could hardly wait to get married, and. It was a lot of different things, and actually. So the graph of do people ever get married looks like that. The graph of when people get married looks like that, and the graph of whether people had kids looks like that. So that there were a lot of spinsters and bachelors who went through life unmarried, or if they did get married, they got married very late in life, and they never had kids. That 1960 is, of course, the heart of the baby boom. And basically everybody was getting married and having kids. And then back now, we're actually, marriage is a less common part of the average person's life now than it even was back here. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing is not actually what I'm trying to argue. I'm not trying to argue, gosh, you should all get married right away, although your parents may think you should. But that's not what I'm trying to argue. What I'm trying to argue is there's been a big change in a really pretty fundamental building block of society, and moreover, and this goes beyond the numbers. I'm working on getting down here quickly. Well, I'll just finish that sentence, but then I won't go on. If you go into more detail about what marriage meant at these various stages, marriage in this period had gender inequality built into it. That's for sure. But it also was what is called by specialists companionate marriage. That is, people thought they were making a union and they were in it together. I'm not denying the gender asymmetry, but people, both men and women at that point, thought they were making a union, and the union was pretty important. But now we have what's called individualized marriage, in which most people nowadays think, well, the first thing is what's happy, and if marriage makes me happy, that's great, but if marriage makes me unhappy, I'm out of here. And that's another aspect of the growing individualism of American life. I repeat, I'm not trying to make a value judgment here. You may think I am, but I'm not. But I'm trying to say, isn't that interesting, the same pattern? Now, What have I done? I've done economic inequality, I've done polarization, I've done social connection, I've done churches. There are other things I could do, but I want to finish the graphs here, but this is not the end of the talk. By the fourth dimension we've been looking at, which is really mushy, and I'm calling it culture. And basically, I'll tell you the story this way. When my research team and I had gotten to this point in the research about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, we had to have some shorthand for just describing what was happening. So the shorthand we came to use, you can like it or not like it, but it was just a shorthand if you're in a team and you've got some concept that is constantly recurring, you need some kind of shorthand. So we began calling this the I, we, I curve. The first part we thought was a characteristic of a society that was relatively individualistic, was happy with, or was content at least with great inequality, was politically very contentious, fighting about all the time. Then the middle period is a period when people were more equal and insisted on greater equality, more collaborative politically, more connected socially. And then we thought maybe we would call this the I society, so I, we, I. And we wondered about culture, but who in the world knows how to measure culture? So stick with me for a moment, because when I finish the next paragraph, you'll know how to do it. How many of you have ever used a program called Google Ngram? Raise your hand if you've ever heard of Ngram. If you haven't, this next paragraph is going to be the most exciting thing you do today, because Ngram is addictive. Google has digitized all books ever published, almost anywhere, even places like China and Tibet, but certainly they have digitized every book published in the UK and in the US since sometime in the maybe the late 17th century, all digitized. And they've got big computers. And if you go to Ngram, you can type in any word you want and type in what language you're interested in. So you type in American English, or you can type in just English, but I'm interested in America, so American English, and then type in some word like laser. And instantly, before you, just like that, will appear a graph showing in every given year of the last 200 years how frequently the word laser appeared in any book. These are all books. These are gardening books and children's literature and mystery stories and medical textbooks and every book published. And so I'll show you the graph for laser. Laser looks like this, where this is, 1800. Not a word, not a peep about laser until 1957. Then there begin to be more talks about laser, and then it begins to tail off toward now. Or Lincoln. You could type in Lincoln, and it's low, but it's still visible. The word is visible. Early years, that's mostly travel books, American travel books talking about visiting Lincolnshire. So Lincoln is coming along, and then suddenly in 1860, people start writing more about Lincoln, and then in 1865, boom, everybody's writing about Lincoln. And then Lincoln, can you guess the explanation for this strange linguistic behavior? And then Lincoln is now still one of the most common topics in American writing, certainly in American biography. Or you can take any word, right? So you can take the word and, A-N-D. It's the seventh most popular, most common word in the English language. And guess what and looks like? And looks like that. Not a jiggle, not a twist. The word and is as frequent in American books, relative to the number of books, as it was in 1650. I mean, it's just absolutely flat. Or the, flat. Or he, flat. Or she, flat. She rises a little bit over the years, but not much. You wouldn't want to bet your tenure on that. But so I thought, sitting in my home up beside a pond up in New Hampshire one evening, I thought, well, I wonder, if you look up a word like community, well, the word community is very rare in books, so it's almost not, it's only reflecting people who read weird books that would read the word community. Not people who read mystery stories. They don't use community. How many times you see Dorothy Sayers talking about community? No. Or individualism is an extremely rare word. But I thought, suppose we just use the simplest thing we can imagine, which is the first person singular pronoun and the first person plural pronoun, I and we. Now remember, to set your expectations right, the, not a twitch. They, not a twitch. And, not a twitch. And I thought, well, let's, just for the fun of it, let's take the ratio of we to I. Come on, why not? Can we have the next slide, please? That's the ratio of the word we to the word I in all books published in America from 1895, or maybe 1890, to today, or actually to 2008, which is when the Google database stops. This is the ratio. And you might say, well, come on, is that really a big deal, or is this just some almost accidental stuff in the data? Most of the action, remember this is a ratio, most of the action actually is in not the numerator, not we. There's been some increase in we and then decrease in we, but mostly in the denominator, I. So most of the action is driven by changes in the frequency of the single letter I. The single letter A is completely flat. The single letter I, in its frequency, doubles from there to there. And you should be unbelievably shocked by that. Remember, this is gardening books and mystery stories and medical textbooks. And it's not just poetry. And every time you say, well, okay, it can't be true of medical textbooks, okay, well, it's not there. It can't be true of gardening, okay, so it's not there. All you're doing is saying in whatever is left, it's even bigger. Do you see what I'm trying to say? Now, I don't want to make my whole academic reputation turn on this one graph, but this graph passes what some of you will know is a very, very important statistical test. It's called the interocular trauma test. It hits you between the eyes. There's something going on there. And it's very far from accidental. I mean, it's significant at the 1/10,000,000th of statistical significance. And isn't that interesting that it peaks at exactly, this is when I thought, maybe I'm onto something here. It peaks at 1964, I think. Now, probably every time I show these graphs to people, there's more, but I'm just going to end the graphs here. Every time I show these graphs to people, the first question is what happened up there? And I'm not going to talk very much, but I actually know what happened up there in all these graphs. You'll have seen the peak was sort of 1964. And the answer is, I personally started to vote in 1964. That's the first year I cast a ballot. And somehow I personally triggered the collapse of American civilization. There are other hypotheses besides that. But probably the most common hypothesis you might have is that, at least I did, for a long time in my project, we thought what we'd been studying was economic inequality and its consequences. So we thought economic inequality was caused by God or by trade or by automation, and economic inequality is the first driver here, and the other stuff like the differences in marriage or the differences in going to clubs or the differences in political opposition, political comity and so on, they're all consequences of economic inequality. I do not know what the right causal story is, but I'm certain that that is the wrong causal story, and I'll tell you why. Of all the dozens of variables we've looked at, they all are actually amazingly closely correlated, but the only lagging variables are measures of economic inequality. They lag the other variables by about 10 years. So unless you live in a world in which causes come come before their effects, it seems to be pretty clear that, and I realize what I'm saying now is highly controversial, it's not all about economic inequality. There are people in this country who've argued it's all about economic inequality, and I believe that economic inequality is really important, and I believe that there are feedback loops, but this is not just all about economic inequality unless you're prepared to argue this crazy world in which, people knew that things were going to get bad, and therefore they started being selfish 10 years earlier, so they'd be ready when the economic inequality hit. It doesn't compute. Okay. So what have I said so far? I've said American 20th century history up until today has followed in many different, not all, I mean, the number of telephones per capita is just a straight line rise. Until recently, life expectancy was a straight line rise, although, as you will know from the work of Angus Deaton, Deaton's work and our work completely coincide, because Deaton says the economic inequality has gotten so bad that now it's going to interfere with, it is interfering with, this uninterrupted 150-year increase in life expectancy. So there are some things, number of, nifty telephones, there are some things that go up steadily. And therefore, it's right when some people say, well, look, everybody has indoor plumbing now, and they didn't have indoor plumbing in 1800. So I'm not saying there was never anything happening. Material, things that are driven by technology, which is essentially material things, we've gotten better. But the distribution of those things has not gotten better. It's gotten better and then worse. There's a lot more to be said, but I want to focus now, I hope you see, I'm not focused on the delta, I'm focused on the second derivative. Can I say that? What I mean is I'm focused on points at which the whole trajectory of society changes. I'm focused, that's why that's so interesting, or the equivalent tops. But that's not the only turning point. That's what I mean by second derivative. I'm sorry, I'm just trying to show you I can do numbers too. That is not, this one, if we had the full data, this is another turning point. We don't have great data back here, but to the extent that we have, which is why I don't actually put it on the graph, but to the extent we have great data, this was also a period like that, in which, or to phrase it differently, there are deep parallels between America's plight in 2019 and America's plight in 1890. Deep, deep parallels. First of all, the growing gap between rich and poor was true then, true now. Secondly, the fragmentation of American society over immigration. The biggest period of immigration in American history was then and now. And just as now immigration is causing, in America and in this country, lots of turmoil, so it did then. And partly because then, as now, there was in fact some real terrorism perpetrated by ideologically motivated immigrants. I don't want to get too far into the debate about that now, but what you may not know is that anarchist Italian immigrants killed more people in the first decade of the 20th century than any terrorists have killed in the last decade. Please don't think that I'm being anti-Italian. What I'm trying to say is we've been through a very similar situation, and the parties were extremely divided. And that had come, we'd had a more or less unified and relatively successful society. Probably the earlier peak was around 1865 at the end of the Civil War. But then things have been going down, and if you'd been around then, you probably would have said, God, America's just going to hell in a handbasket. You don't know your neighbors anymore. Extreme gap between rich and poor, and the political parties are not helping us solve our problem. They're making the problem worse. That's what people said at that time. And then, astonishingly, whatever they did there, something they did, turned it around. And so this is the point of the new book. We have the next slide. This is really, I think, almost, that's what by the way, that's what the graph of the whole looks like. And if we can be mathematical just for a second, that's a summation of all the graphs that I've shown you and some of the ones that I haven't shown you. These are so coherent that single graph accounts for 90% of the variance in any single number. I mean, they're essentially all the same. If you do a time series multidimensional factor analysis, you get one factor. If you know what I'm saying, you'll be impressed. If you don't know what I'm saying, you should still be impressed. It means that there are not 12 different things to explain. There's just one big thing to explain. And so now let's go to the next chart. Okay, so here, I am now at the end of or at least I'm at the pausing point here. So what do I conclude? This is what, if you want to, come at me, and I hope you do, these are the things I'm claiming. First of all, that today's problems, the plight that America's in today, extreme polarization, extreme inequality, extreme social isolation, and extreme individualism, are part of a much wider, much longer shift in American society, which I'm calling the shift from an I society to a we society to an I society. There are some benefits associated with an I society. I do not deny that. I also think there are some bad things about an I society, and that's what we're experiencing now, the bad side of it. Secondly, and equally important, America addressed that same challenge, exactly that same challenge a century ago. So people just like us, in America, I mean, tried to figure out how they could turn it around. They were as dismayed. If you read the literature of the reformers in that period, if you know American history, that was the transition from the Gilded Age to the Progressive Era. If you read the memoirs of the Progressive Era reformers, they were as depressed as reformers are today. How can we possibly turn this around? And then they did it. And they did it big time, right? Because they set America, whatever they did, set America on a course that was in a more egalitarian, more cooperative, more socially connected way for at least roughly 60, 70 years. If a new generation of reformers in America, or maybe even in Britain, is able to do something now in the next 10 years that puts Britain or America on the course for 70 years of progress in the right way, well, then you ought to, you know, it's not like it's perfect. It's never going to be perfect, but that's better than where we are now. That's what I base. So our real point is to figure out what are the lessons from that era. And I have 4 or 5 more minutes, and then I'm going to shut up. Because I want to tell you one more story. It's a story about the kind of thing they did in that period. There was a great opportunity gap in that early period. If you've read or heard about my book called Our Kids, it's a talk about, it's showing the growing gap between rich kids and poor kids. And there was the same gap between rich kids and poor kids in 1900. And people around America were socially aware. We're aware, this is just terrible. Rich kids are doing fine, poor kids are getting worse, like that. And then a group of people, not academics, ordinary folks, in small towns in Kansas and Nebraska, had, it turned out, a really good idea. And in 1910, in some small towns in Kansas and Nebraska, ordinary Americans invented the public high school. Invented the public high school. For the first time in world history, a community of people said, every kid in this town, just because they're a kid, regardless of their family background, are going to get from the community 4 years of free secondary school. And I know this is something like Americans always talk about the biggest and best, but actually that had not been done. There were schools, there were public schools, of course, here, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about every kid in town, we're going to guarantee that every kid in town gets 4 years of free secondary education. That idea, which first originated in 1910 in these small towns in the Midwest, was controversial because if you were, I mean, think of it, you were asking the rich banker and the rich farmer and the rich lawyer in that little town who had already paid for their kids to get a private secondary education. Their kids were now off making money in Chicago. You were trying to persuade them they should pay for other people's kids to get that same advantage. It was controversial, but in these little towns at first, there was enough social capital, enough sense of solidarity that they did. And it turned out to be the best public policy idea Americans have ever had, because it did 2 things simultaneously that economists tell us you can't do. On the one hand, universal high school education, the idea spread, it went viral amazingly quickly. So within 20 years of that invention in a little towns in the Midwest, virtually every town in America had a high school. So it's McDonald's rate of diffusion or Google's rate of diffusion is nothing like that rate of going from 0 to 100% diffusion in 20 years. Well, maybe Google. And so it did 2 things. And one reason, this is why it went viral. First of all, it raised everybody's level of income. It helped everybody because it turned out that was a huge dollop of human capital. So the American workforce instantly, as those graduates of high school came out, was way better educated than any workforce in the world. And economic historians say that decision to have universal secondary education accounts for most of American economic growth in the whole of the 20th century. A big deal. It's not winning the Second World War. It's not having resources. It's not having Henry Ford. It's massive infusion of human capital via social capital. And at the same time, it leveled the playing field. So it did what economists tell us you got to choose. You can have growth or you can have equality. That reform gave us more of both. And indeed, if you unpack the graphs I've just shown you, between 1900 and 1970, we had high rates of togetherness, high rates of equality, and high rates of growth. And after 1970, we were more an I society, but did that give us more growth? No, it gave us less growth. So I'm resisting the idea that we've got to choose, and some people say you've got to choose between equality and liberty or equality and growth. That's not the record historically. The things we did to get greater equality also turned out to produce greater growth. So very quickly now, I'm just going to, the point of our book is not to say high schools is it. If you just have a high school, you're going to fix all of America's problems. That's not it. I'm trying to say, what's the strategy that these reformers used? The first thing is grassroots mobilization is essential. All the really good ideas came not from academics, but from ordinary grassroots people in ordinary towns connecting with one another. There was a massive grassroots mobilization between 1900 and 1910. It was labor unions, it was the suffrage movement, it was settlement houses, some of the ideas we borrowed from Britain. So that was essential, because that began to lay the political groundwork for supporting later national reformers. Secondly, solve problems locally and be really bold. I want you to see that the high school reform, which sounds, no, I mean, did anybody have to invent the high school? You say it's kind of, everybody must have had a high school. No. And when it was invented, it was really bold. Can you imagine now saying, overnight, we're going to get everybody in Britain a college education? It felt like that. I'm not saying that's the right thing to do now, but I'm trying to say it was really bold, but it was done locally. And then share ideas so you can see which are working best and which are not working. The point I'm trying to make here is that it's not, these ideas did not come from Washington and they did not come from Harvard. They came from thousands of ordinary civic entrepreneurs trying lots of things, most of which did not work, but some of which did work, and the winners, you know, spread nationally. And then eventually made it to the national level. So the New Deal, the big reforms of the New Deal, were almost all invented, not in the 1930s under FDR. They were ideas that had been invented in the Progressive era and then in the New Deal were swept up and made national. That was an important step, but the real inventions were coming earlier. Another point that I want to emphasize, I'll talk about more of this if you want to talk about the question and answer, is bridges were essential. These were not, the local groups were not siloed. It was not that we had one group of people working on women's suffrage and another group of people working on union membership and another group of people working on clean water. They were collaborating. They didn't collaborate enough across racial lines, and the single most important defect of that period was the inattention to race. I'm happy to talk more about that if you wish. And so I do want a new progressive era. That's what I'm arguing for, really. That's the one sentence. I want to have a new progressive era, but I want to have a new progressive era that is appropriately sensitive to diversity in the 21st century. And lastly, charismatic national political leaders are important. Teddy Roosevelt was important. He was the lagging. That was the last thing that came into line. So we shouldn't go looking for some savior nationally who's going to fix us. We've got to begin the process now. And if we get far enough along, some national charismatic leader will come along. And I thought personally, confession, I thought for a while that Barack Obama might be that person, because Barack sees the world in exactly the way I've just described, and I know because I've talked to him at great length. And he kind of hoped that he could be the Teddy Roosevelt of our current era, but he was, to my great lasting dismay, he was a little too early because we didn't have that previous grassroots mobilization. That's my story. I'm sticking to it until the first question.
Okay. Thank you. Like I said, if anybody has to go, because it's a working day, we understand, so please do slip out. But let's get to the we part of the discussion. Yeah, if you just say your name and...
Sure, Stuart Rose, thank you very much for a fascinating, insightful and very entertaining speech.
I'm sorry.
Thank you for a very inspirational and entertaining lecture.
Thank you.
Really enjoyed it. If we were here in 150 years' time, do you think there is an inherent cyclicality? You've shown two parts of the graph. You think there's data from before, which have shown us getting there. Do you think this is just an internal mechanism, dynamism, which means we do this? Even we can't explain it.
Yeah. No, I don't think that it's, I'm not a determinist in that. I'm certainly not capable theoretically of imagining what, I mean, could I describe such a cycle? Sure, and I know that there are other people who talk about cycles of various sorts, not just this one, but others. But I'm much more empirical than that, and I don't know whether there are cycles. The one part about the cyclical, long-term cyclical theory that I dissent from is that it is much more determinist than I think is appropriate, either empirically appropriate or, more important, in action terms. At the time of our progressive era, a very well-known commentator, Walter Lippmann, wrote a book called Choice or Mastery. I'm sorry, Drift or Mastery. The book, Drift or Mastery, was about this question. We're in this terrible situation. He's writing in the middle of their terrible situation, just as we are now. And he's saying, well, maybe it's so complicated, the world is so complicated, we don't know what's happening. Maybe we should just drift and it'll all work out. And he made an argument that's not the way we're in. We're in a situation in which we need to try to master changes and not just go with the drift. And that is a way, in a way, it's a pre-empirical belief, right? And that is very much my belief. My belief is these are not some, you know, if we just wait, eventually it'll turn around. Maybe it will, or maybe it won't. I mean, that's what I really fear, is that I fear if we just drift for another 20 years, I'm out of here. It'll be your problem to worry about. But it'll also be my grandchildren's problem to worry about. And I may not care about your fate, but I do care about my grandchildren. They're personally going to, this is what I'm going to say, my grandchildren are personally going to be all right. They're all well-educated. They have well-educated parents. Their grandfather's a Harvard professor. They're all set. But they're going to be living in a world that I don't want anybody to live in. Is this making clear? If we just drift. So that's why I'm resisting this idea that, you know, it'll all work out. Maybe the internet will save us. I don't actually, I mean, I think the internet is really interesting, but I do not think that just drifting with the internet is going to automatically fix this problem. Does that answer your question?
It does. If I just really quickly, but on the basis we can master it and get it better, which would be nice and optimistic, will it just be another 70 years before the pendulum turns again, I guess is the question?
Maybe. I mean, honestly, I think it's really hard to predict. As a famous American baseball player said, prediction is hard, especially about the future.
Okay, we'll come right to the back there.
Hi,
Hi.
I'm Alice. I specialise in political theories around polarisation.
I'm sorry, say it again.
My name is Alice. I specialise in political theories around
Yes.
polarisation, and I love Golden Malone. I'm really excited to read your book.
Thank you.
I guess I'm struggling a little bit with your link between political polarisation and then inequality. Mainly because the graph showed that political polarisation, as you defined as cross-party collaboration, peaked in the 1940s, which we'd assume was to do with the world wars and that kind of thing. And also, a lot of cross-party collaboration exists because of the existence of a significant other, which at that time was the Bolsheviks, the Nazis, all that kind of thing.
Are you talking about British data or American data?
I'm talking about both, so I specialise in both American and British.
I think I would love to. But it makes a difference, actually. I do not think that's what the American data show.
Okay, well, regardless of that, I guess what I'm struggling then to see is how does the political polarisation is defined as this kind of cross-party collaboration, and other people define it according to principal component analysis across, you know, you have two people have different perspectives, let's say on abortion, the further across they are, the more polarised you are.
Actually, I know the literature, that's not the definition I'm using.
I mean, I haven't read your new book, and so I'm just following your argument as I've seen it. So I guess my main question is, okay, so what is the link really between polarisation? Because I think of polarisation instead of being sentiment analysis across, like, can we get on with the other? Not necessarily are we getting married to the other, but can we get on with them? So what is the link between political polarisation truly, and then potentially inequality as you've seen in this literature, particularly because the graphs that you showed showed a peak in 1940, everything else was 1960, and I can then see that 10 years later the income inequality changed.
Well, it's going to be a hard conversation a little bit because I actually read the data in America differently from you. I read the data as there was certainly a peak in 1940. Actually, there turns out to be a peak in 1941. The peak in on some of the graphs that I've been looking at, like the difference between the party differential in valuations of the president, which is another measure. I've got 15 different measures of polarization, not just this cross-party voting stuff. That happens to peak in January of 1942, and it's perfectly obvious why that was, right? December 1941, the Japanese attack, in January of 42, we all loved each other. So there was a peak. But then that peak, it's the level of cross-party evaluation of the other guy's prime minister or the other guy's president. Is this making sense? No, it's one measure. That stays high. It's got some ups and downs, but it stays at a higher plateau until 1970, and then it begins to fall. The break in most measures of, as I read the data, the break in most measures of political polarization in America comes after 1970. There, as you know, I'm sure you know this, there is a huge literature, not huge, there's a large literature in America trying to disentangle economic inequality and political polarization. So there have been a lot of people who've looked in detail at those numbers and tried to figure out which was first and which was second. And maybe you and I agree, actually, that if you look in really close terms, the inequality peaks a little later than, I said that before, right? The economic variables are the lagging variables. And really careful methodological analysis of those two curves alone, that is the two curves that I showed here, the inequality, the economic inequality curve and the political polarization curve, can detect a lag of about 5 years between the peaking of political comity and the peaking of economic equality. So as far as those two variables are concerned, I guess I do sort of agree with you. But honestly, neither of them, the earlier peaks are other variables. I mean, for example, if you had to look at all the variables I've looked at and put them in one big system and say which turns first, it's union membership turns first, well before any of the others. I'm skeptical, I have to say. I've done a lot of this kind of analysis, and I'm trying to respond to you in this way, but I'm honestly skeptical that the data actually are strong enough for us to be able to detect small differences in sequencing, because I think, in fact, this is very likely to be an equilibrium in which, in some respects, economic inequality affects polarization, and in some respects, polarization affects inequality, and they all affect, to some extent, social capital, and all those are affected by and affect the cultural change I'm talking about. If it sounds like I'm saying I don't think this is a fit subject for statistical causal analysis, that's true. I think this is a case in which you have to tell a narrative, fundamentally because of multilinearity. Fundamentally, these curves are all so closely correlated that it's a little bit arbitrary to pick out. I think you have a different sense of what the data are, but as I've played with the data, and not just these measures, I think it's very difficult. It's just multilinearity. It's very difficult to distinguish one as being systematically ahead and more powerful than the others.
Do you have the data available, like, something like that?
I'm sorry, do I have the data available?
Yeah, just so that you can play around, because also like putting in data like World of Warcraft communities and kind of all of these very different things that are growing in the digital age might be quite interesting.
Sure, and the data will be available after the book is published.
Let me come down the front here, and then I'll keep going around. You guys.
Eric Beinhocker, Oxford University. First, just thank you for your decades of scholarship on these very important topics. My question is about your interesting result on cultural individualism.
Yeah.
Could you dig into that a bit more? Do you have hypotheses on what could cause such a big rise? Is it a baby boomer phenomena? Is it some shift in norms or culture with that generation that accounts for it? Or do you have some other hypotheses on what's going on there?
Well, I have some thoughts, but I'm trying really hard. This book is bold enough anyhow that I'm trying hard to avoid getting drawn into a detailed debate about what caused this particular curve as opposed to that particular curve. The curve on individualism is a very striking graph, and actually you can see it in lots of popular culture too. It's a little harder to quantify that, but the first half of the Beatles' career was very much about togetherness. It was acoustic guitar, and most of you have never heard of the Beatles, but the Beatles were a song group in that earlier era, and the first half of their career was very much about togetherness and love. But the last, do you know, I will sing you the lyrics of the last song the Beatles ever recorded. Not the whole, not all of it, just the last. It was me, 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 me. That was Paul. I've sung for you the entire lyrics, and that was in 1972, I think. And there are lots and lots of other pop culture stuff. It's a little hard to quantify that, but what would have caused that? Well, partly it might be the baby boomers. I mean, I'm prepared to indict the baby boomers for a lot of things, including bowling alone. But there's another part of the data. If you look at Google's, I mean, Ngrams, for things like conformity or conformism, the pattern is very interesting. The people writing about there are other ones, you still illustrate the same thing, those are the two that occur to me right now. Books about rebellion or conformity or conformism begin to rise very sharply in the 1950s. And they stay way high until the middle of the 1960s, and then they collapse. And I read that as saying concern about excessive togetherness was actually rising. We were in some sense running into the downside of excessive we-ness, and people writing books were beginning to detect that. I don't mean that they kind of said, oh, we're getting too conformity. I mean, well, they did say they were getting, and the other directed man, and all, there was a lot, there's a whole literature in the 50s. And then that literature evaporates in the middle 60s as the second half of the 60s comes online. So I think there might very well be an argument that actually we were running into headwinds from ever-increasing conformity as the downside of communitarianism began to appear. Does that make sense?
Okay, we'll give this 4 more minutes, so let me go as quickly as we can. You there, sir, and I'll come to you next.
Thanks. I'm interested in your I-we test from a linguistic point of view.
You're interested in Mike?
In the I-we test that you showed a graph.
Yeah.
From a linguistic point of view.
Sure.
I was wondering if the graph you showed us takes into account other forms of those pronouns, like me and us.
Yes, they're identical.
Yeah.
All the other cases, that is, my, our, me, us, all of them show the same thing, and none of the other pronouns, he, they, it, show a similar pattern.
And thanks. And secondly, I mean, you must have tried this test in other languages as well.
Yes. There's a literature, actually, on this in other languages, which generally shows a growth, not every place in the world, but way more often than not, show a growth of I after, I mean, America, the turning in America is earliest. That is 65, roughly speaking. But there's a similar graph in Ich or Wir, and there's a similar graph in only looking at British books, and there's a similar graph in most modern languages. I will say a little bit more about the linguistics. No, by the way, nobody ever, so to my knowledge, no one has ever looked before that. So everyone, the linguistic literature on this is entirely limited to, from my point of view, is a very special period, the period of increasing I. And that's documented. No one has even looked at whether there was an earlier period of increasing we, and that's, I mean, leaving that, other people can write their books about their other countries. There's one more thing to be said about that. The word we actually is linguistically ambiguous because it's ambiguous what the community that we is referring to. We could mean we college professors, or we Putnams, or we Americans, or we socialists. So it's we is ambiguous as to the breadth of the community involved. And I is much less ambiguous. I always refers to the speaker or the writer. And if the trend were only in we, it would be actually quite ambiguous as to what was happening when we starts becoming less, because it could mean that it was less because of the we, the widest we, or it could be because people were less talking about we socialists or whatever. But the trend is actually sharpest for I, and that's the pronoun that is least ambiguous grammatically. Is that making sense?
Yes.
Let's try and get two final questions in.
Yeah, Nicolas Valentino, Joint Venture. Thank you for a very insightful talk. I'm surprised that you didn't mention at all during the talk the structure of information, and particularly news and media, and how maybe things like CNN in the 80s, followed by the internet, has changed the structure and speed at which we consume and make sense of information. Actually, in that sense, I think Tortoise media is a very needed creation in solving some of the problems.
Could you go back, I think, one slide, please? That's the summary of the charts. I think the internet is really important, and if we had more time, I would talk a lot about the internet. But the internet is actually not unambiguously communitarian or individualistic. It's, in some respects, the internet encourages communitarian-like trends, and in some respects it encourages highly individualistic trends. I mean, the selfie or the curated eye is a consequence of the internet. You could say, well, that's extreme individualism, but then there are obviously other cases in which people are making communities on the internet. I'm at the same, almost simultaneously with this new book, there's a 20th anniversary edition of Bowling Alone, and the only change is going to be, there's going to be a chapter on the internet, and I'm going to be trying to say what I think about the internet there. But on general information, we did actually ponder whether information structure or somehow would be, remember, this is what we're trying to understand. And you basically don't see the impact of the radio there, you don't see the impact of telephone there, you don't see the impact of television. Remember, I was the one who once upon a time said it was all about television, but when you look at this graph, you don't see, I mean, I can make up a story that television is this, and I did make up that story in Bowling Alone, but actually, I honestly don't, and you don't see the internet there at all. Now, you could say, well, that's because the internet changed everything, but the internet surely did not, if anything, it accelerated inequality, because the rich people now are the people who became billionaires because of the internet. So I'm not trying to be dismissive, and it may be that you guys can work on it enough to find out that there's a direct causal link from some kind of information transformation that fits this, but don't think it's a straightforward sell, because, I mean, do I think information structure is important? Absolutely, it's very important. I don't know whether it's important for this or not.
The local news has been decimated, and slow news has been decimated by the speed at which news gets there.
Yeah, but the problem, I agree with that, but the problem is all of that happens over here. The local news was doing just fine in the 50s and 60s and 70s.
Okay, Paul finally, and then we'll have to call it a day.
Thank you. Paul Lusk. Just a reminder, the first Beatles, #1, certainly in this country, was Please, Please Me. And I often think of my generation as the Please, Please Me generation. Anyway, I'm going to probably ask you... Win
by the lyrics, lose by the lyrics. That's what I've just learned.
Yeah, people were in 1915 were 13 when Please, Please Me came out. Fascinating talk. I have a worry about this thesis, which is that it's very self-contained about America, and maybe the same things would also apply in Britain. And I know you're not just interested in America, because I read your stuff on Italy before Bowling Alone came out. And it's great, but two kind of words that have come into my mind as you've spoken are 5 lesser words, China and India. And it's a very unfair question at the end of this fantastic talk, but have you looked at an international dimension about the fact that inequality between wealthy countries and what were very poor countries at a national level has reduced, that the we generation was about American power, and 1970s you have Nixon to China, you have the Vietnam War. How far can we look at this and say, the we identity, as in this country, the we identity was about Britain, world power, the we identity in America, half how that was about being American, what that meant, and which was genuine, you know, world power and domination, economically, politically, and, you know, a big part of the Trump appeal is, you know, we've given this all to China, we must go and get it back. Is that a dimension at all? It's a really unfair question. Is that a dimension that you've thought, you know?
Yes, I agree. It's an unfair question.
Sorry.
No, I'm very aware of that trend. Of course, I am. Do I think that therefore, because America was the dominant power during much of this period, actually during much of the whole period, America was the dominant power measured by many of these things. It wasn't just, that didn't just start with with the end of World War II. It was.
Going back to 1900?
Pardon?
You went back to 1900 and the upswing?
During that period, America was
growing.
Yeah, I see. So the idea is, well, America was growing to some extent during this whole period. Could this be just a very special case in which the only really dependent variable is global domination? If you have global domination, you can be a we and then not. I wouldn't rule that out. I'm certainly not going to make any claims about what's happening in other countries, because honestly, this was true in Bowling Alone too. People wanted me to say, is that true in England, or is it true in France? And the first reaction, actually, in the Bowling Alone case, it's been 20 years, we know what the reaction is. The first reaction was, it may be America, but it's not true here. And I can't tell you how many articles were written saying this is a uniquely American problem, and therefore that would be consistent with global power causing Bowling Alone. I could point you to a dozen articles in the first 5 years after Bowling Alone, and then I could point you to 24 articles afterwards that says, oh, wait a minute, it's also true in Britain, and it's also true in Germany, and it's also true actually in a lot of places. And I tried not to take stands on the universality of the claim either way, but I actually think it's possible that there may be similar trends in other countries. The one case which actually we know for sure is that the trend in increasing I-ness in the n-gram I-ness has been increasing in China as it's moved toward global power. You might think, well, that's fine. Of course it is. But unfortunately, that's contrary to the theory that global power makes you a we.
Put you on a theory.
Go on. Bob, thank you so much. Normally at this point we try to sum up. I'm not going to try to do that today for reasons of time, and we've had a summing up already. And I did want to say in response to your point as well, from the beginning actually we've tried to think about Tortoise as having some interest in social capital. We are an organisation built on engagement, on networks, on trust. A lot of the areas that we're interested in have similarities with the areas that Bowling Alone touches on. So I think the thing that I'll take mostly from this is a fascination with what role it is that an organisation like Tortoise can play in the kind of entrepreneurial, small-scale uptick that you ended with at the close of your talk.
I only want to say, forgive me for interrupting, but that reminds me that I either misinterpreted or too narrowly interpreted your question. I took the question to be about the structure of information, and I don't think that is so important. But I do think that we have could you go to the last slide with the, the next, that's there. There. Another lesson from that era that actually is in the book, but that I didn't call out, but I should have called out, is muckraking journalism. Muckraking journalism, that is journalists reporting on all these bad things, was absolutely essential to this era. I'm not saying what would be true in this country, but not just finding out evil secrets of wrongdoing of powerful people, but trying to understand what caused that. And I could name for you 10 or 20 books published exactly in that era, on slums, on urban corruption, on economic malfeasance and so on, that did more than just say, oh, there's this evil person, but said, here's structurally what's going on. It was actually essential to that. So,
off we go. Listen, thank you all for coming. It's been great to have you here. Bob, thank you so much for your time.